Learning how to make easy chicken and dumplings from scratch is a great way to stretch your meat and stretch your budget while still eating something delicious. If you don't know, chicken and dumplings is a classic southern dish. Basically, it's chicken soup with little bits of dough floating in it. I know it sounds like it wouldn't be that good, and it is kind of a struggle meal, but it's delicious if you know how to make it. The first step of the recipe is to make the vegetable stock. So I simmered garlic, onion, carrot, celery, and bay leaf on low for an hour and a half. Once the vegetable broth cooled down, I strained it and then added chicken leg quarters. I used 2 small chicken leg quarters that were just over a pound total. I simmered the chicken leg quarters without the skin on low heat, gas mark 2 out of 6 for an hour and a half. Once the chicken had cooled down enough to touch, I took it out of the broth and took the meat off the bone. Be sure to save the resulting broth because it's the base for the recipe. Sometimes chicken and dumpling recipes, they don't have any vegetables, but I'm going to add some vegetables, some carrot and celery. I have the equivalent of probably 1 large carrot and 1 medium celery stalk. Just to show you how I cut it, I like to take my carrot and slice it like this. And then what I'll do is I'll go back and cut the pieces of carrot in half. You don't want to have huge pieces of vegetables because then it will take longer to cook, but you don't want them too small either because depending on the texture that you like, they might end up being too mushy. But like I said, this is supposed to be an easy recipe from scratch, so I would not go through a lot of, as Argentines would say, quilombo, worrying about, oh, is everything cut to the right size? And see here, the bigger pieces, I'm even cutting them in half again. I'm going to add those. Now for the celery. And once the carrot and celery are in the pot, I'm going to turn it onto high. And I am going to, once it reaches a boil, I'm going to boil it for 15 minutes. That I think is enough to get the vegetables soft. And now that the vegetables are boiling, I'm going to continue to boil them on high for 15 minutes. My celery and carrots just got done boiling on high for 15 minutes. So now it's time to focus on the dumpling part of making chicken and dumplings from scratch. In this recipe, the dumplings are simply little pieces of dough that are cooked in the broth. Some people use canned biscuits, Bisquick, or even pie crust. A lot of the traditional southern recipes call for rolling out the dumpling dough like you're making a pie crust and then cutting it up and dropping those pieces of dough into the broth. But what I've seen and what I like to do is easier, I think. It's basically a batter that I will drop into the broth, and there's no rolling out, nothing like that. Here I have, if you have self-rising flour, use half a cup of self-rising flour. If not, then do what I do. Half a cup of all-purpose flour, 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking powder, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. To that, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of melted butter, a 1/4 cup of milk. I'm using skim, but I have used whole. I'm sure you could use water. I've even heard of people using a little bit of the chicken broth. So honestly, you can use a lot of things. And also, I'm going to add half a teaspoon of parsley. There are other spices that I'm going to add later, but to the dumplings themselves, I'm going to add half a teaspoon of parsley. I'm going to rub it in my fingers to release the flavor. Most dumpling recipes don't call for, now I'm getting it everywhere, they don't call for any spice in the dough itself and the dumplings themselves, but some of them call for parsley. I tried it and I really liked it. So I'll show you that. Now that I'm done making my dumplings from scratch, it's time to add them to my chicken broth. I turn the heat onto medium, so now the broth with the vegetables is boiling again. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take a teaspoon, dip it into the dumpling dough, and I'm going to take a rounded half teaspoon. This is actually probably a teaspoon, but since it's only taking up half, it looks like it's less. But you have to take into consideration that the dough is mounded on the tip. So I did it like this so that it would have a round shape. All I'm going to do is, like I said, take a bit of dough, round it on the tip of the spoon, and I'm just going to slide it into the broth. Like I said, like this. Nice and easy. I honestly think that this type of dumpling is the easiest type to make. Well, I guess maybe if you bought a pie crust, that's easy. But with my recipe, all you need is flour, baking powder, salt. If you have self-rising flour, that's all you need. I just finished dropping all of the dumplings into the chicken broth. So now I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. The chicken is already cooked. I'm just going to break it apart a bit and add it back to the broth. Like I said, traditionally you boil the chicken and then you use that broth, but if you have a roasted chicken and you want to use some leftover roasted chicken, you could definitely do that. And notice I'm not shredding it totally. I still want to have pieces of chicken. So I think usually chicken and dumplings, it's not super finely shredded. There are still chunks of chicken. And also time for the spices. Here I have half a teaspoon each of garlic powder, onion powder, black pepper, and salt, and then a 1/4 teaspoon of poultry seasoning. So I'm going to add that to my broth. I'm just going to stir. I'm probably going to add a little bit more water, maybe a cup. We'll start off with half a cup. And I'm just going to let this cook, like I said, for 15 minutes. However, if you have never made homemade chicken and dumplings from scratch before, I would wait and add the spices until the very end. Sometimes if you add spices before your broth has boiled down, it is going to reduce due to evaporation. When you finally serve your soup or your stew, you'll find that the spices are more concentrated and you have too much salt or too much pepper, too much of whatever. On that same note, even though I do think that poultry seasoning is one of the secret ingredients in my easy chicken and dumplings recipe, it can be a bit strong, so be careful. If you add too much, it can make your soup taste bitter. It's been about 6 minutes since I set the timer. I did add a bit more water, but not a lot. I would say this pot has a total of 5 cups of liquid in it. I'm not stirring it a ton. I'm just going to stir it maybe once every 2 minutes, very slightly, so that the dumplings don't break apart. And if you see that one dumpling is a little bit out of the liquid, to see if you can take your spoon, it's easier if you have a ladle, and ladle the liquid over the dumpling. The dumplings have now been boiling for 15 minutes on medium heat, 3 out of 6. So now I'm going to turn off the heat, just baste these here a little tiny bit. As you can see, the dumplings definitely puffed up. That's from the baking powder. As you can see, some of the flour came off the dumplings as they cooked, thickening the chicken broth. The broth will continue to thicken as it cools, so the flour will make it nice and creamy without adding milk or cream. I would let it cool for 10 to 15 minutes before serving. How do you know when the dumplings are done? It can be a bit confusing because it's not like a cake where you can stick a toothpick in, and your dumplings might not all be the same size, but if you take a dumpling and you cut into it, let's see if I can do this here. You cut into it like that. The inside should not look wet. So see the inside here? You can see it here better. It looks dry inside. It doesn't look like it's undercooked. That's how they should look. That dumpling is done. Even though this is technically a struggle meal for hard times, my homemade chicken and dumplings from scratch recipe is surprisingly delicious. I'm usually really good at explaining exactly why I like something, but to be honest, I know I really like this chicken and dumplings recipe, but I can't put my finger on exactly why. I think what it is that it has the perfect combination of flavors. Chicken, butter, spices, vegetables, a hint of bay leaf, along with a very nice combination of textures. With the soft, yet not too soft vegetables, the pieces of chicken, the dumplings, and the thickened broth. However, in my opinion, the three things that make this recipe the best are the butter, the parsley, and the poultry seasoning. Honestly, once I made this recipe, and for the dumplings, I left out the butter and just added more milk, and let me tell you, I could definitely tell the difference. It was nowhere near as good. Since then, I did some research on chicken soup recipes, and I discovered that some people add butter directly to their soup. So I'm guessing that's why sometimes homemade chicken soup is one of the best things on earth. The poultry seasoning is really important as well. It just goes so well with the chicken. And I think that the parsley in the dumplings just adds a little bit extra flavor that really puts this recipe over the top. Now that I'm holding the bowl up close, I wanted you to see just how creamy the broth is because of the chicken fat and the bit of flour that came off of the dumplings. Even though there is a good amount of flour in the broth doesn't taste like flour. I think that it boiled for long enough that the flour lost its raw taste. Although you could add cream or milk to the broth to make it even thicker and richer, I honestly don't think that's necessary. I thought it was good just as it was. One final thing that I did want to mention is that most recipes call for boiling the chicken with the skin. Although you could definitely do that, I always take off the skin and some of the fat before boiling the chicken because I try to be a little bit healthy. If you watch my channel, you know I like things that taste good, and I thought that this was fine even though it was a bit lighter. This recipe is really easy and really versatile, so if you want to add some vegetables, do some store-bought broth, and then add pieces of rotisserie chicken, I think that would be fine too. As you can see, making homemade chicken and dumplings from scratch is really easy. Although this recipe doesn't look like much, it's actually great. It's amazing what can come out of struggle. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.